Testing, testing, 1, 2, just making sure that this is recording. Perfect. Okay, yeah, so we've gone over basic materials. We've gone over how to import 3D models. As always, we have our review session on Fridays. If you want to go over this, we can go over all of it again. Honestly, this is probably, well, it's in a way the most difficult, but in another way, the easiest unit. Just because if you kind of follow the lectures, it's very fast to get your assignment done and to get 100 on it. But also, if you're an artistically minded person and you want something very particular, like you want something to look just so, it can be very challenging to get things to look exactly the way you want. So it's kind of the easiest to get done, but it can be as hard for yourself as you want to make it, right? As with most things in life, you can kind of put as much time into it and make it as difficult for yourself as you want, depending on how much of your skills you want to develop. Is there someone at the door? Sorry? No? Okay, good. All right. So we briefly went over particle effects. As I was just saying, I am not an expert in particle effects by any means. I stumble my way through it. I can kind of get it done. And we had just started sort of building this tornado particle effect. Right, so this is our system here. And you can see we have two emitters. We have our kind of center tornado, and then we have our tornado debris. And the way we determined which emitters that we wanted to build to make our tornado is we went online, we looked at a video of a tornado and said, what are all the pieces that make this thing believable, right? If I look at a tornado, what am I going to need to build in Unreal Engine to make it look realistic? Now, if I recall, I was very much struggling to get the velocity solver to kind of get this to spin correctly. Oops. Anyway, so we're just going to do something very simple. We're going to replace these like default circular sprites with something that more closely resembles a tornado, right? If we go down to the bottom, we've gone over kind of particle spawn, which allows us to set the shape, determine like the locations that our particles are spawning, and add a little initial like physics, right? So when we add velocity to something, we are saying like throw it in that direction, right? And we went over particle update a little bit here. And this is where we can add all kinds of forces that are applied to the particle after it's been spawned, right? So each of these little white dots that you see here is a particle, right? And the reason that we use particle systems is that they're just a much more efficient way of rendering a whole bunch of the same thing with the same forces being applied to it. Like we could go in and make a blueprint and spawn 1,000 static meshes and apply force to each of them, but then our game would run at 2 frames per second and no one would be very happy. Okay. The last of these tabs here, right? So we have our spawn, we have our update, is this render tab. And the render tab just controls the appearance of our particle, right? So you can see here on the right-hand side of our screen, we have this sprite rendering tab. We have a material and a whole bunch of rendering settings. The one we're going to be focusing on is our material, right? We've made materials before. Materials just govern the appearance of something. So in our case, our material is saying this particle should just look like a little kind of white radial gradient. But we can replace this material to make this particle look like something else, like a puff of smoke, like a piece of a fire, like a glowing red orb, right? You can kind of make the particle look like whatever you want, as long as you can make a material that looks like that thing, right? So I'm just going to double click on this material to open it up, right? So we have this default sprite material. This is provided by Unreal Engine. And you can double click on it to open it up. And you can see it's just a material graph, right? We've made materials before. The main difference is that you'll see we don't have things like base color, metallic, specular, roughness. We're really only dealing with two channels here: emissive color and opacity. Okay, so emissive color is similar to base color. It's just the color that this particle emits, right? And opacity is pretty self-explanatory. It's just how much light passes through this particle, right? If something is opaque, it means that no light passes through it. If something is not opaque, right? So if it has less than 100% opacity, light will pass through it. So you'll be able to see the stuff that is going on behind the particle. Like you can see here, right? I can see the background behind this particle, right? This is not the only particle effect that Unreal Engine provides, luckily. In order to find more stuff that Unreal Engine provides, we need to look at the engine content, right? Now, you probably don't have this engine folder in your content browser. So we're going to make it so you can see the engine folder. Now, by default, this is hidden because it just tends to kind of confuse things. At this point, I trust that you understand that all of your content goes into your content folder. If you want to see the engine folder, in your content browser, you go to your settings button here. And it should be here in the content tab. You can see show C++ classes, show developer content, and here show engine content, right? If we set this to true, we'll see the engine content. And the engine is just another project kind of within our project, right? So our engine has a content folder. If we open this up, you can see all of the various components that make up Unreal Engine, right? We have Slate and Slate Debug, which is a user interface module. We have a VR module. We have a localization, which is like a translation module. We don't need to worry a whole lot about all of these, but if you're curious about how everything in the engine actually works and you kind of want to open it up and look under the hood and see what's happening, this is how you do it, right? You look at the engine content and I can just be like, oh, okay, editor shapes, what's going on here? This is the stuff that they use, the textures and the materials they use to apply to shapes in the editor, right? I'm just going to search. I'm going to go into my content browser and I can search. I can just type in smoke. And you can see that it provides these two textures, this thing called a sub-UV animation, which we're not going to worry about too much right now, and this material, M smoke sub-UV black body. This is just a fancy way of saying that sub-UV just means we're breaking up the texture into smaller pieces. Right? We can just take this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this material into my content browser. So I just hit Control-C, moved into my folder and hit Control-V. And this is just so that I don't overwrite something, so that I don't change something that Unreal Engine provides and accidentally break something else. And I'll just change the name of this from M smoke sub UV black body, which doesn't really tell me a whole lot. I can call this M smoke particle, and I'll put your section there, right? There's our material. Now, if I double click on this, you'll see there's a bit more going on. The main difference is instead of just having this kind of flat particle color, we are using a texture, or actually a couple of textures, to define the look of our particle. And you can see in our preview, our particle looks like these little tufts of smoke. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to replace the material in my tornado here. So here's my tornado center. I can go in to my sprite render and just replace this material. And to do that, I can just drop down. And here's the one, M smoke particle. Okay, so I'd say my main issue would be the color, but also the size, right? Now, if we recall the size of our particles, we set that when we spawn them, when we create them. So I can come in here and just increase my sprite size a little bit, like so. And you can see we have a bit of an issue. Right now, our smoke particle is spawning like the whole thing, right? If we look at our material here, I'll just put it onto a plane so we can get a better view of it. This is what our material actually looks like, right? And that's because our texture has a whole bunch of different smoke tufts, right? When you look at the way that smoke kind of billows up in the real world, it's not like a single uniform repeating tuft of smoke, it kind of changes, it might bend. So to simulate this, we just kind of spawn each particle as a random one of these. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my, let me just close these down here. Let me go back to my particle system. Okay. Back to my sprite renderer. And we have this thing down here called sub-UV, right? We sort of went over UVs when we talked about materials, right? UVs are, imagine a square. Imagine a square. What do I do with these markers? Okay, we have a square. Okay. Imagine it's like a graph. Down here we have our U-axis. Here we have our V-axis. This point is 0, 0. And this point is 1, 1. Right? So sub-UVs, basically what we're doing is we're saying, well, subdivide this, right? If we have, 6, let's say our grid of particles is 4 by 4. So we have kind of 2, 3, 4 particles here, and another 4 here. Right? Each of these is its own kind of separate subtexture within a texture. We can say, all right, we'll subdivide this and treat this image as though it's made up of 16 different UV sets. So here we have this sub-UV blending. We're going to toggle that to true. And for the image size, I'm going to double check. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 by 8. So we can set the sub-image size to 8 by 8. And now you can see each one is spawning as one of those random little tufts of smoke. Okay. I'm going to increase the velocity force again. Hopefully get this tornado spinning. This is bothering me that it's not spinning. Okay. Just gonna give this a second. And I don't really care whether or not you use like a kind of more advanced material. We'll import some simpler sprites. You don't need to use a sub-UV sprite. You can just use a texture, right? If you have a little smoke texture that you found online and it's just the one, just use the one. If you find a lightning bolt texture. Okay, here we go. Now our tornado is spinning. That's good. So the one thing I would say about this is if we look back at our reference, our tornado kind of spin was not, or our tornado color wasn't this black color. It was kind of a mid-gray. And so in our initialized particle, we can come in here and try and set the color. Right now, it's just set to white, which is kind of odd. Right? If it's set to white, why is our thing black? We go to our M smoke particle here. You can see that this smoke particle was built for like a separate thing. Like Unreal Engine used this smoke particle as an example. And so we have this thing here called a dynamic parameter. And it's looking for an input parameter called temperature. Okay. Now we could go in here and define an input parameter for temperature. Or we can just override this material and kind of bypass it like this. All right, so I'm just going to get rid of this for now and see if that works. And we can go over input parameters, dynamic parameters in a moment. You can see just by getting rid of that, I've kind of made this closer to what I'm looking for, as I'm just using the default color of our sprite. Yeah, this vortex force is even a little too much now. There we go. Okay. Now, if I want to have a little bit more control over the color, if I go back to my material here, we can multiply this. We have this node here for particle color, right? Particle color. We can just multiply this by the color that we set in our particle system, right? So our particle color here, this node in a material will return, if I go back here, whatever color we set here. If I click apply and save, it should now be tinted this kind of yellow color. Okay. Now I can kind of set the color of my tornado to be whatever I want it to be, which is kind of this like darker gray, like so. I'll say again, I don't really expect a whole lot from you in terms of particle effects. It's not really what I'm qualified to evaluate, but I can again just kind of like stumble my way through it by doing some research, right? So let's say for your assignment, you say you want to make a lightning bolt, you want to make a laser, you want to make, you know, dust that goes behind the wheels of your car. And you say, well, how do I do that? I would go onto YouTube and just look up some tutorials, start, right? Because that's honestly what I do half the time. I'm not an expert in particles, okay? That's all I really have to say about particles in general, right? You have these three sections: particle spawn, which controls the initial state of the particle, the size, the color, and the location that it comes into the world. You have the particle update, which is typically used for things like physics, right? Right, so in our case, we are applying a force upwards to pull our smoke up because our tornado kind of twists upwards into the clouds. And we're applying this vortex force to get it to spin. And then in the sprite renderer, we replaced our default sprite material with this one that we pilfered from Unreal Engine, right? Which we can then go in, look at, use as an example, and kind of copy. We can copy this as many times as we want and just kind of plug in flat colors, plug in new textures to kind of create whatever material for whatever particle that you want, okay? Okay, that's kind of all I really wanted to cover for particles. Your section is much farther ahead than the other sections, so we have a lot more time to review particles in more detail if you want, right? If it's something that you're interested in. Okay. Go back to materials for a moment. So far we've created this kind of basic surface template material, right? And we created a material function to handle our UVs and tiling. This is what we've done in previous lectures. We've used a little bit of math right, in the form of multiplies and lerps to kind of modify the data that comes out of these textures. And we made our material by plugging in all of these individual channels that represent the physical properties of the material, right? And we exposed all of these things as parameters. The way we did this is I held 1 and I clicked to create a constant. You can do the same thing with other things. So if I hold 1 and click, it'll create a float. 2 will create a 2D vector. 3 will create a 3D vector. And you can just right click on any of these and say convert to parameter. And we also exposed these images as parameters, right? So if I double click on this, you can see this is the image that I downloaded online. And it's just an array of colors, right? An image is just an array, 1024 by 1024, with, in this case, color, but can represent anything, right? Can represent our roughness here. Double click on this, you can see this is just a representation of how rough the surface is. Where it is white, it is absolutely rough. You know, the roughest surface known to man, sandpaper, shark skin, you name it. And where this surface is black, it is the smoothest surface known to man. And where it's gray, it's somewhere in between. So what images let us do is they allow us to store very complex information, very realistic and naturalistic looking information, and kind of project it onto our world. Okay, this is basic review of materials. Once we've created a material, we can right click and create a material instance. And here you can see I created this asphalt material. You can see all of those parameters that we exposed in our base material are here. We can modify them, right? I can add a little bit more to the displacement, can make it a little bit more reflective. Maybe this is wet asphalt, so it's going to be a little bit more specular. We can tint it and reset the textures to whatever we want. Where we find these textures, I believe I posted this into your content review channel on Teams. If I go to your section FS2, content review. Oops, I guess I didn't. I'll include those today. ambientcg.com. Oops, ambientcg.com. Into our materials tab here. You can see here are all of the texture sets that are freely available. Just pick 2 of them, download them, and create material instances. Set your textures and set your parameters to try and best match the look of the material that you're going for. Okay. Sorry, I posted this for the other sections, but I realized I didn't post it for yours. Okay. You can see here, this is an example I used for another section. You can see here that we have a material for our landscape, right? A lot of you have landscapes in your levels. One of your final lab options is to create a landscape material, which is to do something like this, right? Because if we look at a landscape, let's just look at a reference. I was using a desert as an example for another section. Let's look at like a, I don't know, like a beach cliffs landscape. Or actually, you have a farm, right? Let's look at a farm. Okay, here's a good example. So when we're creating a landscape, unlike our basic surface, which was just like one set of textures representing one surface, right? Asphalt, paving stones, metal, plastic, you name it. A landscape is a little bit different, right? Actually, farm is a really bad example. They tend to be pretty flat. We'll go with a mountain land. We live in Alberta. Mountain landscape reference. Let's take a look here. This is a good one. Mountains are a good example for this. Let's take a look at a mountain. Painting, well, let's find something real. We'll just kind of scroll through. Here's a good example. Okay. So here we have a mountain, right? Here's our landscape. Now, if we look at the material that we would need to apply to this landscape, it's made up of a whole bunch of different surfaces, right? Here we have this kind of like cliff face on the side here. Even this cliff face is made up of what looks like a couple of different kind of rock textures. We have this kind of what's called scree. If anyone's a hiker, this is called scree, this kind of like gravel and rocks here. We have this maybe a like granite or igneous rock here. I'm not a geologist. We have this here. Down here, it looks like we have just some dirt or some small pebble trails. Then we have some grass over here. And then we have snow up on top of the mountains, right? So the way that we've approached materials so far isn't really going to work for the material that we need on our landscape, right? We need to blend between a whole bunch of different surfaces. And so this is one of the instances. I know that I've warned against just kind of like right-clicking and creating a material every time you want to do something new. But this is one of the cases where it makes sense to create a new material, only because the material, like the use case for this material is so radically different. We kind of just need to create a new one, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to right-click, create a new material, and I'll call this M Landscape FS2, right? And I'll also open your sample level so that we're not looking at this. Okay. So here's our landscape. You can see it's this ugly gray grid. We're going to create a landscape material. And to start, we're just going to do some simple debugging. Let's see if we can just paint two different colors onto our landscape. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose the node Landscape Layer Blend. Landscape Layer Blend. And it gives us this green node right here. And I'm just going to plug this into my base color. And you can see that this node has no inputs, right? But if we select it and go to the details panel here on the left-hand side, we can see that we have this layers array right here. And I can click the plus button to add an element to the array. So I'm going to add a layer to our landscape. Right now, it just says layer none. If I expand, I click on this little arrow to expand the layer info here. I can set a name for this layer. So I guess I'll just call this one like cliff. And then I'm going to create another layer and I'm going to call this one maybe snow. Well, call it grass, just to keep things simple. I'm going to hold down the 3 key and click twice just to create two constant colors to distinguish between these two layers. So I'll make my cliffs this kind of like mid-gray. And I'll make my grass nice kind of puke green. Whenever you're making kind of debugging materials, like test materials like this, I always recommend making them as ugly as possible so that you don't leave them in place when you're done. Usually in game development, whenever you have like a placeholder material, it is like bright hot pink and it has text over top of it that says replace me, just so you do not miss it or forget that it's a placeholder. Okay. So here I am in my level. I'm going to select my landscape. And in our details panel here, you can see we have this option. I believe it's under the landscape tab for landscape material right here. Landscape material. You can also just go to the search and search landscape material, right here. And I can just click and drag my material onto my landscape. Okay, it's not an ugly gray grid anymore, but now it's just this flat black material. So I haven't really solved my problem here. I'm going to go from selection mode into landscape mode. Right, so this is what we use for our first assignment, where we use the sculpt and the manage tools to kind of create a spline and to sculpt our landscape into whatever shape we wanted. But we have this third tab for paint, right? And you'll see at the bottom of our painting landscape menu here, we have two layers, grass and cliff. These are the two layers that we defined on our material. And it will also provide a little preview of what they will look like when it's painted onto the landscape. I'm just going to select my grass node and I'm going to start to try to paint. I'm going to click, right? And it's going to give me an error. It says, this layer has no layer info assigned yet. You must create or assign a layer info before you can paint on this layer. Okay. What does this mean? Unreal Engine needs somewhere to save what we've painted onto our landscape. Like, it's not going to know by default what's painted where. Right? We need something to tell our landscape, what sections of it are grass and what sections of it are cliff. To do this, I go to my layer on the left-hand side here, and we have this little plus button here that says Create Layer Info. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to choose Weight Blended Layer Normal. And you'll see we get this little menu, and this is just saying, where do you want to save this? And it'll, by default, create this little folder that's whatever the name of your level is, _shared assets. It's fine, you can save it there. And you can see once I've created that, now it is filled. Because this is the first layer, it just assumes that it fills our landscape. Now it is filled with this gray color instead of the black color. Now I'm going to do the same thing for my grass. I'm going to click plus and say Weight Blended Layer Normal and hit save. Okay. Now if I select my grass layer here, so this is where you select kind of what you want to paint onto your landscape when you click. So I'm going to select my grass layer here, and I'm just going to start painting. You'll see it'll take a minute to load. And now you can see I can just paint my grass layer onto the landscape. I can paint it green. I believe I can hold Shift. Shift and click, and it will erase. Okay. In addition, you have like brush stamps and stuff. This is kind of more advanced. I would go into this if I were teaching an environment art course, which I'm not. But if you go online, you can find all kinds of like, if you've ever used Photoshop, anyone here ever used Photoshop, done any kind of digital painting? Yeah. Okay. So you'll know that when you use a brush in Photoshop, that brush has a texture. You can do the same thing. You just go online, you find some textures, you import them. And if I click this, right, you can see right now the default is just this checkerboard. I can just paint my grass in a checkerboard across my landscape if I wanted. But I could also bring in, say, like a more naturalistic, kind of like a noise texture. If I'm painting patches of grass, I might go into Photoshop and actually just make a kind of patchy texture that I can then stamp across my landscape to get a more realistic looking blend between the two layers. Again, not mandatory, but if this is something that you really want to go into or learn more about, this is kind of how you would do it. Okay, so this is all well and good, but I'd like my landscape not to just be flat colors. I'd like it to actually look like a landscape, right? I want it to have all of the benefits of the materials that we've created so far. I want it to have a normal map and an ambient occlusion map to get the best looking landscape material that I can. Okay, so just like with our basic surface over here, we can bring in textures and use textures instead of these flat colors. And then we could go in and create a landscape layer blend for each of these different channels and make sure that we, if I create another landscape layer blend, I need to remember to go in and click ++ and make sure that I am super disciplined and name all of my layers correctly and all of that. That is how most tutorials will show you how to do this in Unreal Engine. It is the wrong way. It is very slow. Like, it will work, but it will take a lot of time. And if you want to go back in and change anything later, for example, add a layer, modify one of your layers to make it look different, replace it with something else, it is going to take you forever. It's going to take so long. So instead, we are going to make this simpler. We want to be able to take the output of our landscape layer blend. I want this to blend kind of entire materials as opposed to single channels. I'm just going to hold Alt and click right here, just so I disconnect it. And I'm going to select my output here. And with this selected in our details panel, you should be able to find this toggle here called Use Material Attributes, right? Use Material Attributes. I'm going to click True. And you'll see that it's collapsed my output to this single tiny node with this single pin. Now, if I try and plug this in, it's going to give me an error. It's going to say, no, like a single color is not a full material. So we need to create something that allows us to get an entire material and plug it into here. To do this, I'm going to use a material function. I want a function that I can just drag and drop to quickly and easily create new layers, right? So we used a material function to do our kind of tiling and offset here. Just to kind of reiterate what a material function is it's just a reusable piece of code that we can drag and drop and use multiple times. Given that every single one of our layers is going to be using a certain amount of consistent code, it just kind of makes sense to use this to avoid repeating ourselves. I'm going to right-click, go to Material, and create a material function. And I can call this mf_landscape, not landscape pair, landscape layer. And I'm just going to organize myself a little bit more here. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it Material Functions, and I'll move my material functions into that folder. Not mandatory, I just like to be organized. I'm going to double click on this and open it up. And you can see we're missing an output, but this is just like our material graph that we created our base material in. And it's like most of our graph editors, we can right click to create nodes. The node that we're going to use, I'll show you the easy one first. Call it Make Material Attributes. Make Material Attributes. And this should look fairly familiar. This looks kind of like the output node of our base material. We have our base color, metallics, specular, roughness, all of the properties that make a material a material. The only difference is it has this output here that kind of passes them all as a single pin. So I'm going to do that, and I'm just going to plug that in. And I'm going to go to the textures I brought in here. I'm just going to bring in this paving stones one, just as an example. This is the one that I used as an example before. I'm going to select all of my textures here. I'm going to click and drag them in. Right. So here are all of the textures that we used for our regular material. I'm just going to plug these in. My roughness, plug that into my roughness. And my ambient occlusion, plug that into my ambient occlusion. And my paving stones, I'll plug that, or the normal, I'll plug that into my normal. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on the background grid here, just so I have nothing selected. And I'm going to toggle this thing here, exposed to library, to true. And what this does is it just lets us, if we right click, I can now search for MF landscape layer. I'm going to rename the one for this section so I don't get it confused with the one from the other section. Landscape layer FS2. All right, so I can now just look up my landscape layer. I can just find my function in my menu here and add it that way. Okay, I'm going to go back to my landscape material. I'm going to right click. I'm going to find my material function here. MF underscore landscape layer 2. Here we go. And you can see now we have a material function that returns an entire material as an output, right? It's returning every single property of our material, regardless of what kind of material we're making here in our results. I'm going to plug this into my cliff layer. And then I will plug this into material attributes like so. Now, if I go back here, it's going to compile. And you're going to see here, it's going to take a second just to, it says preparing shaders. You can see now the layer that was previously that flat gray now shows this kind of paving stone material like so. Okay. But obviously, if we go over here to where we painted our grass, it's just this kind of shiny black material. You can see it's blending, but like this doesn't look very good, in my opinion. And right now, if I just dragged and dropped this landscape layer function in, it would still just be more of these paving stones. So we need to expose some inputs to our function, right? So far, we have like the material functions we've created haven't had any inputs. They've just kind of had parameters inside of them, and they just provide easy, clean outputs. This one, we need to tell it what textures we want to actually be in our layer. If we look at our texture sample thing here, you know what the these input does? It kind of stretches and scales and offsets our texture. And right down here, we have this text node here. And the text node, whatever we plug into here, will tell this texture sample what texture it should sample, right? So texture sample node, what this is actually doing is it's going to the hard drive and saying, there's a texture here, load it into random access memory, so that our graphics card can then go into random access memory and get it and load it as a whole bunch of individual pixels that we can then project onto the surface of our world and make our thing look like paving stones. Okay. But there's another kind of texture object. It's literally called a texture object right here. Texture object. And if I take a texture object and I plug it into the text node here, this is the texture that it will sample, right? Now you can see because it just took this default texture, that's what a texture object is by default. It has this little default texture provided by Unreal Engine. It's now sampling this texture instead. Now, some of you who have followed along and kind of are starting to get the workflow of materials might think, okay, well, let's right click, convert this to a parameter, and go through and do that with all of our textures, and hey, problem solved. There's our landscape layer. Not quite. When materials get compiled down into HLSL, which is kind of the base code language that all shaders are made out of. Well, most shaders in Unreal Engine are made out of HLSL. It's going to take all of the parameters that have the same name and treat them as the same parameter. So if we have multiple landscape layer functions, all of which have, let's say, a parameter named base color texture, when we go into our material instance and set that parameter, it's going to set every single base color texture on every single layer to the same texture, which completely defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do, which is blend multiple materials, multiple surfaces. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to right click and I'm going to type in function input here. And you can see we have this node called input in. I want this input to be for my base color texture. So for my input name, so with my node selected, I go to my details panel. With my input name, I'm going to choose base color texture. And down here, we have this drop down where you see input type. Right now, it's saying vector 3, which is like a color, a position, rotation, direction, something like that. We can click on this drop down and come down here to where we see function input texture 2D. I'm going to take the result of this input and I'm going to plug it into my base color texture like so. And you can see it's going to throw a little error, which is basically saying, wait a second, this input doesn't have like a default texture assigned to it. So you're telling me to sample a texture, but you're not providing me a location on the disk. No, I can't do that. I can't sample something if I don't know where to look. So I'm just going to take this little default texture object I made and I'll plug it into the preview just so we have like a default if we don't plug anything into here. And I'll hit save. Now, if I go back to my, my landscape material where I now have this function, you can see that my function now has this input for base color texture. And you can see in brackets, T2D is an abbreviation of texture 2D. It tells us what type of object or what type of data this function is expecting. I'm going to go in here to my paving stones. I'm just going to click and drag my texture into my material here. And when you just click and drag a material or a texture like this into your material, you'll see it creates this texture sample. And I won't be able to click and drag, right? This is just a vector, it's RGB, and this is expecting a texture 2D. The fast way to get the texture object is just right click and say convert to texture object. Now I can plug that in. And then I'm just going to select this function here. I'm going to copy and paste. Control C, Control V, there we go. I'll plug that into my layer grass. And I'm going to find another texture set. I think I have one. OS3 has a really nice kind of like brown mud leaves texture. Here we go. I'm going to click and drag and right click, convert to texture object. I'll plug that in and apply and save. Now it's going to take a hot second to load again. But now you can see I have my one base color here and my other base color here. I'm now blending between these two textures. Now, right now, this looks kind of weird because I'm still using just like the paving stones normal and roughness and stuff. So if I look at this, it's still lit as though it's made of paving stones. That's because I'm using the paving stones normal now. I'm just kind of overlaying the color of this like mud and grass and stuff on here. So we need to go back into our material function and just do this for all of our different inputs. So this is our base color. I'm going to select these two, so this texture object and this input. I'll hit Control C and then Control V to paste, copy and paste. I'll plug that in here and I'll call this input roughness texture. I'll grab these, hit Control C and Control V. plug it in here, and I'll call this normal texture. I'll grab all these, Control C, Control V. I'll call this ambient occlusion. Plug that in. Now, if we go back into our landscape and we look at our landscape layer function, we just need to do the same thing that we did. We can click and drag our textures into here. In this case, I'm just going to copy and paste this node 3 more times. Now, right now, these are all for our base color. Like if I select this texture object and look at the texture that it's actually getting, it's all just getting the base color. I can just click and select, paving stones. Here's my normal, and then here's my roughness. I can just find these in this drop-down pretty quickly and just plug them in. Does this sort of make sense? We've defined a function. What this function does is it takes a whole bunch of basically addresses on our hard drive in the form of texture objects and converts them into a very basic material. And this way, instead of having, in our case, 4 landscape layer blends, potentially more, we just have 1. If we want to add another layer, we can add an element, use our function to create another layer, and just plug it in. Okay. I hope this more or less makes some sense. It's not mandatory to create a landscape material for this course. It's just, in my view, kind of the most obvious lab option for most of you. So, and in my experience, this has been the lab option that most people have picked in the past. So it's just nice to give people a little head start on how to figure out this. Okay. So you can see I've plugged in all of the kind of my whole texture set. So my brown mud leaves has a color, an ambient occlusion, a normal, and a roughness. So does my paving stones. And now you can see this is no longer lit as though it is a paving stones. It now actually looks like my brown mud and leaves. And if I come over here, this actually looks like my paving stones. Okay. And here at the edges, it kind of smoothly blends between the two. Nice smooth blend. Okay. What else can I show? Okay. If I press play, this is another common issue that we run into with these. If I press play, here's just my little demo level. If I look at my landscape, there is something that kind of stands out to me. And that is, it's very obviously a repeating texture, right? So if I kind of zoom out, it becomes even more obvious. And it's also kind of shiny, so we'll kind of have to fix the specularity of it. But if I look at my landscape like this, I'll just go back to selection mode so I can see it a little bit more clearly. You can see this is very clearly just a square texture that gets repeated again and again and again to create the illusion of a continuous surface. And one of my responsibilities when I work as a technical artist is to kind of look for things that break the illusion, right? Look for things that remind you that you're playing a video game and not actually immersed in the game that you're playing, right? Because if I look at this, I am immediately reminded I'm not actually driving a car around a track. I am playing a video game because this looks fake. So one of the ways we can solve this is kind of by scaling up these textures. Now, we've already done this with one of our material functions. If I go to my material functions, we have our tiling and offset function here. Unfortunately, we do need to kind of deviate from that a little bit with a material or with a landscape here. What I'm going to do is in my landscape material, okay, I'm back here. I'm going to right click and search landscape layer coordinates right here, landscape layer coordinates. This is basically like your landscape UVs, right? This says each of our layers, this is where they are, and this is what they occupy in space. And just like before, we can multiply this. I'm going to hold down the S key and click to create a scalar parameter here. And I'm just going to rename this parameter to tiling. And I'll set its default value to 1. And I'll plug that in. So this is very similar to what we did with our kind of basic surface material, where we took our texture coordinates. It's the same thing, just our landscape. Instead of being a typical object, it kind of has its own special coordinate set. And then we multiply it to scale those coordinates up and down, right? But we have a problem. Like our texture objects here don't have a UV input, right? I can't just like go in and plug them in like this. But if I go back into my landscape layer function here, our texture sample does have the UV inputs, right? This is where we actually tell it what pixels on our texture to sample. So in my landscape layer, I'm going to right click and add a function input. And right here, it says my input type is a vector 3. I'm going to select this dropdown and make it a vector 2 instead. And for the input name, I'll just call this UVs. Okay. Then I'm just going to take this and plug it into the UVs of all of my texture samples here. Normally, I don't like it when nodes kind of like crisscross one another like this. I find it difficult to read, but material functions are kind of one of the few cases where I'll let it slide, for me anyway, only because this is not meant to be looked at. You know, it's meant to be looked at here, like this. And you can see now our landscape layer has this UVs input. And we can now just click and drag and connect our UVs like so. It'll take a second to reload. Okay. But we have a bit of an issue. And this is that we've kind of assigned our template, which is typically called a master material or a parent material. We've assigned this, so we can't actually access our parameters. We've defined this tiling parameter, and we want to be able to set it. So I can right-click on my landscape material here and create a material instance. And I can call this MI mountain landscape FS2. And then on my landscape, I can just assign my material instance. And now if I double click on it to open it up, you can see here we are. I can go to my tiling value. And I can just kind of scale up my materials like so. And now when I press play, it's a little less obvious that this thing is Oh, come on, let me minimize this. It's a little less obvious that these rocks are a tiling texture, just because we've made the tiles a little bit bigger. So it's just a little bit harder to see where the seams are, where the texture repeats. There are many other techniques to kind of break up the tiling on landscape materials. This is the easiest one. In our review session, if you want to go over kind of more advanced techniques to create kind of seamless blending landscapes, we can go over that, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this course right now. Okay, so here we go. I would say I still have one issue with this landscape material, and that looking at it, it's very shiny, right? If I look at this, this looks like plastic. It's weird, right? Like stones, cobblestones shouldn't shine like so. So I'm going to go back to my landscape material here. And in between my landscape layer blend and my output here, I'm going to right click and I'm going to type in set material attributes, set material attributes right here. And we have this green node that takes a material attributes input and outputs material attributes. I'm just going to plug it in the middle here. With this node selected, I can go to the details panel. And we have this attribute set types thing. This is not a very descriptive name, but I can click plus in this array. And now you can see I have this input for my base color. So I can just override, I can take an entire material and say override the base color with whatever I plug in here, but keep all of the other attributes that I've set. And you can see here in the details panel, we have index 0 and this dropdown. Instead of base color, I'm going to select this dropdown and choose my specular, like so. Then I can hold down the S key and click to create a scalar parameter. I can just create a specular parameter, set to 0 by default. And I'll click save. And it'll take a minute to load. And now my landscape, fingers crossed, should no longer be shiny like it's made of plastic wrap. It's made of PVC tubing or something. Here we go. Perfect. There we go. Okay. This is the basics of how to create a landscape material. With that, that's about all I wanted to go over today. It was just how to create a landscape material and kind of just play around a little bit more with particles. Again, I don't have super high expectations for particles. I'm not very good at them. I just kind of stumble my way through and figure them out. With this, if you follow along, hopefully you have the baseline to create your own landscape material for your lab, right? Which, you know, again, if you're doing it for your lab, I would take a look at your reference landscape and actually create all of the different layers. Go on to Ambient CG or Polyhaven, look for materials that actually match those layers, bring them in, and apply them. Okay. And that's it for today. You guys are free to go. We'll just call it there. Come to the review session if you have questions, if you need any help catching up. We will go over anything that you've missed. Okay.